Montana Territory, July 1881. They said she was unfit to be a bride the day she walked back into town, dust on her hem, a baby girl on her hip, and another clinging to her hand. The town of Dry Creek had not changed much since Susanna Dearing left 2 years ago, heart cracked, reputation in tatters. The hills still rolled soft and gold, the church bell still rang at noon, and the people still whispered behind their hands. But Susanna had changed. She was leaner now, older in the eyes, her dark hair tied back tight so it would not blow wild in the wind. She was not here to beg or explain. She was here because she had nowhere else to go. Her girls Opal, 5, and Olive, 3, were quiet beside her as she led them past the general store, past the livery, past all the folks who stopped talking when they saw her. She kept her head high and her steps steady. She had done what she had to do, and now she had to start over. The old Dearing homestead, left to her by her late father, sat on the western edge of town, half-eaten by weeds and forgotten by everyone but her. She laid her hand on the porch rail and felt the wood groan beneath her fingers. Still standing, like her, she did not cry. She unpacked what little they had, washed her girls in a tin basin, and boiled beans over the hearth. When night fell, she sat in the doorway with her rifle across her lap, watching stars come out one by one. She had no husband, no kin left. Just her and her girls, that would have to be enough, but the moment word spread that Susanna Dearing was back, tongues loosened. "She's ruined," a woman hissed in the dry goods store. "Who'd marry a woman who ran off and came back with 2 kids and no husband?" another asked. "She's not fit to be anyone's bride." Susanna heard it all. She said nothing. She just bought her flour and sugar, thanked the clerk, and walked out with her chin high. Then, 3 days after she returned, a cowboy rode into town. His name was Jasper Boone, and he came out of nowhere, like thunder from a clear sky. He rode a buckskin gelding with a silver mane and wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded eyes sharp as broken glass. Folks said he had worked cattle down in Wyoming, broke horses in Colorado, and once fought off 3 rustlers with just a branding iron. He tied his horse outside the saloon, nodded once to the sheriff, and walked inside like a man with a purpose. Susanna first saw him that afternoon when she brought her girls into town for cloth and soap. Opal tripped on the boardwalk, and before Susanna could reach her, a strong hand caught the child's arm. "You all right, sweetheart?" Jasper asked, crouching beside Opal with a steady look. Opal nodded, wide-eyed. "She is fine," Susanna said, stepping in and lifting Opal onto her hip. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were guarded. Jasper stood, his gaze moving to her. "You must be their mother." "I am." He looked at her a second too long. "Name's Jasper Boone." "Just came in from the south." She nodded once. "Susanna Dearing, you from here?" "I was," she said. "Now I suppose I am again." He gave her a slow nod, then tipped his hat to the girls. "Well, you all take care." She watched him walk away, not sure what to think of the way her chest had tightened. A week passed. Susanna worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, patching the roof, boiling laundry by hand. The girls helped where they could. They were quiet, well-behaved, and clung to her like shadows. No one offered help, and she never asked for it. Until the morning her roof gave out. It had rained heavy the night before, and by morning the back corner of the roof had sagged and buckled. She stared at it, fists clenched, as water dripped into a growing puddle inside the house. She had no money for a carpenter, no time to fix it herself, no one to turn to. She was still standing there, trying to figure out how to fix it, when a voice behind her said, "Got a ladder." She spun around. Jasper Boone stood a few feet away, hammer in hand. She blinked. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged. "Saw your roof from the hill. Figured you could use a hand." "I did not ask for one." "I know." She hesitated. "Why?" "Because I do not like watching good people drown under bad luck." She said nothing, just stepped aside and pointed to the ladder behind the shed. He worked all morning, shirt off under the sun, sweat dripping down his back as he hauled rotted planks off and replaced them with fresh boards he brought himself. Opal and Olive sat on the porch watching him like he was some kind of storybook hero. Susanna tried not to watch, but she did. At noon he climbed down, wiped his face, and nodded. "Should hold now." She handed him a glass of water. "Thank you." He drank it slow, then looked at her. "Folks in town talk too much, I know. They do not know a single thing that matters." She held his eyes. And you do. I know what it looks like when someone is doing everything they can to survive. Her throat tightened. She looked away. I do not need your pity. I'm not offering any, he said quietly. Just respect. Something in her chest shifted. He started showing up more after that. Fixing a fence. Bringing sweet feed for the girl's goat. Teaching Opal how to toss a lasso. Olive followed him like a kitten, giggling when he lifted her onto the fence rail to watch the sun go down. Susanna watched him, wary at first, but every time he spoke to her daughters, his voice softened. Every time he looked at her, it was not with judgment, it was with quiet admiration. One evening, after the girls had gone to sleep, she found him sitting on her porch, polishing his saddle. I never asked why you came to Dry Creek, she said, sitting beside him. He shrugged. Looking for a place that felt like home, and might have found it. She looked at him. Why me? His eyes met hers. Because you are strong, because you keep standing no matter what they say, and because the first time I saw you, I could not look away. Her breath caught. He stood then, slowly, and reached for her hand. She let him take it. I do not care what they called you, Susanna. You are the only woman I have ever wanted. She felt her heart crack open like the sky before a storm. They said I was unfit to be a bride. He stepped closer. They were wrong. And when he leaned in and kissed her, it was not rushed or wild. It was steady, certain. Like he had been waiting for this for her for a long time, she kissed him back, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt the weight in her chest lift. She was not alone anymore. The first frost came early that year, silvering the prairie grass before September's end. Susanna woke to find a skin of ice over the water barrel, and Olive's toes curled cold against her side. She rose before the girls, pulled her father's old coat over her dress, and stepped outside into a wind that bit through wool. Jasper was already in the yard, hammering slats onto a new chicken coop he'd started 2 days earlier. He worked without fuss, the kind of man who did what needed doing without being asked. She watched him a moment, arms folded tight against the cold. You could have waited for daylight, she said finally. He didn't pause. Coop's near finished. Didn't want the hens freezing come next week. She picked her way through the brittle grass, eyes scanning the boards. You measured all this by eye, he nodded once. Close enough. That hen house might outlast the house. He straightened then, brushing sawdust from his hands. If we're lucky, it'll hold long enough for your girls to gather eggs without freezing their fingers. She looked at him carefully. You always talk like you plan on being here a while. He met her gaze. Do you want me somewhere else? She didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, because the truth of it was still new in her bones, and speaking it aloud felt like stepping off a ledge. Inside, the girls were stirring. She turned toward the door. You hungry? He followed without waiting for an invite. That morning, she ladled cornmeal mush into bowls while he sat at the table with Olive on his lap, letting her comb his hair with a bent spoon. The way he let the child lean into him, without flinching or shifting away, pulled something taut in Susanna's chest. After breakfast, she bundled the girls and walked into town alone. Jasper stayed behind with a list of chores she scratched onto the back of a seed envelope. She didn't ask him to. He just took it and nodded as if they'd been sharing lists for years. The general store was quieter than usual. Miss Thistle, white-haired, eagle-eyed, stood behind the counter, arranging bolts of flannel. You're needing winter cloth, she asked, not unkindly. Couple yards, Susanna said. Wool if you've got it. Miss Thistle measured without comment, but her gaze lingered. You're keeping company with that cowboy, I hear. Susanna held her eyes. He's fixing my roof and my coop, and teaching my girls how to carry kindling without spilling it. Humph. Miss Thistle folded the fabric. That sounds like more than company. Susanna took the cloth and left without another word. On the way home, she passed the churchyard. The bell tower was quiet, but Reverend Ellison was out front chopping wood. He paused when he saw her. Miss Dearing, he greeted. Glad to see you back in town. I never meant to leave it, she said, surprised by her own honesty. He rested his hands on the axe handle. You've been through more than most. You've come back stronger than many would. She waited, expecting the judgment that always followed. Instead, he said, if that man's caring for your children and treating you with dignity, the Lord's work is in it. Don't let the town's gossip drown that out. She nodded once and kept walking, her throat tight. Back home, Jasper had repaired the barn latch and dug a shallow trench to divert runoff from the house wall. The girls were napping, curled under the quilt she made from her mother's old dresses. He was on the porch, sanding down a length of wood. She stood beside him, laying the cloth on the rail. "I don't know what to make of you," she said. He didn't look up. "That's so. You work like you plan to stay, but you haven't asked if you're welcome to." He paused, then set down the wood. "I figured you'd tell me when you wanted me gone." She leaned against the post. "That's not what I want." He watched her, quiet. She didn't look away. "You're not just helping me. You're filling the corners I thought would stay empty." He stepped closer. "You sure you want them filled by a man like me?" She reached for his hand. His fingers were rough, warm, real. "I'm sure." He brought her hand to his chest. "Then I swear I'll never leave you wondering again." They stood like that until the wind pushed against them, and the scent of frost gave way to the promise of snow. Inside, Olive stirred in her sleep, and Opal called faintly for her mother. Susanna stepped back. "Come inside. It's too cold for promises on the porch." He followed her in without hesitation. By mid-October, the wind had teeth, and the cottonwoods along the creek stood stripped and bare. Susanna packed straw around the base of the house to keep the cold from seeping through the floorboards, while Jasper stacked firewood beneath the eaves. Neither spoke of the coming winter, but both moved with the quiet urgency of people who knew what it could take. The girls had begun to call him Mr. Boone without prompting. He never corrected them, only smiled with his eyes when Olive reached for his hand or Opal asked him questions about wagon oxen or prairie fires. He answered everyone seriously, like each word mattered. That morning, Susanna found him at the table polishing a pair of worn leather boots. "Those yours?" she asked, setting a kettle on the stove. "They were my brother's," he said, voice low. "He died south of Fort Laramie during the winter of '73. Took me 3 years to get them back." She watched him a moment. "You said you'd been through Wyoming, but you never said why." "I worked cattle for a rancher outside Cheyenne, rode fence, ran drives, but I wasn't headed anywhere in particular. Just kept moving." She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. "Why'd you keep on like that?" He ran a thumb along the sole of the boot. "Because I didn't know what I was looking for, and now," his eyes lifted to hers. "Now I do." She didn't look away. Later that day, she hitched the wagon to the mule and made the long ride to the Simmons farmstead, where old Martha Simmons kept hens that laid through winter. With Jasper repairing the eastern wall of the barn, she took the girls with her, bundled in shawls and mittens stitched from leftover scraps. Martha greeted them from her porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're wanting pullets, I reckon, too, if you've got 'em." Martha nodded and led them to the coop behind the smokehouse. As they waited for her to catch the hens, Susanna noticed her daughter's eyes fixed on a small wooden cradle sitting just inside the kitchen window. "That belonged to my youngest," Martha said quietly, following her gaze. "She died last spring. Fever took her in 2 days." Susanna's hand settled gently on Olive's shoulder. Martha's voice held no bitterness. "Folks forget how fast things can change. One day your house is full, and the next it's empty as a water bucket in August." "I haven't forgotten," Susanna said. The woman studied her with something like understanding. "Neither has that man of yours. He came through here last week, asking about lumber and where to find decent wheat seed. Said he was helping you prepare for spring." Susanna blinked. "He didn't mention that." Martha handed her a crate with 2 speckled hens. "He didn't seem the kind to brag." On the ride back, the wind cut sharper than before, and Olive nestled close against her side. Opal held the crate in her lap, whispering to the birds like they were old friends. Susanna kept her eyes on the road, but her thoughts stayed on Jasper quietly helping, laying plans without show. When they returned, the barn wall stood whole again, the boards fitted clean and tight. Jasper met them at the gate, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. "Pullets?" he asked, lifting the crate from Opal's lap. "They'll lay if they stay warm." He nodded and carried them to the coop without waiting for more. That night, after the girls were asleep, she found him in the lean-to sharpening his drawknife. The lantern cast long shadows across the dirt floor, and the air smelled of pine shavings and cold iron. "You went to Martha's farm last week," she said. He didn't stop his work. "Wanted to see if she had seed corn worth saving. You planning to plant come spring?" If the ground's ready, she stepped closer. Why would you do that if you weren't staying? He set the knife down and looked at her. I've never been one to ask what I haven't earned. But if you'll have me, I'll stand by this land and everyone on it. She felt the air shift between them, and if I said yes, she asked, voice just above a whisper. I'd start building a proper room on the back of the house, he said, eyes steady, one you could close the door to. One that's yours. She searched his face. You'd marry a woman they still won't speak to in town. I'd marry the woman who rebuilt her father's house with her own hands and raised 2 daughters on grit and kindness. I'd marry the woman who looks at me like I'm not just passing through. She took a long breath. Then you'd better start measuring for that room. He crossed the space between them without hesitation, and when he kissed her, it wasn't cautious or hesitant. It was the kind of kiss that settled things, the kind that made promises without needing to be spoken. Outside, the wind rose against the siding, but inside the lean-to, beneath the warm light of the lantern, Susanna leaned into the only man who had ever looked at her without asking her to be anything else. By late November, snow had dusted the high ridges west of Dry Creek, and the river had begun to freeze in shallow places. Jasper rode out each morning before light to hunt, returning with hare or grouse slung over his saddle. The girls waited by the window to see what he'd bring back, their breath fogging the glass. Susanna sewed in the evenings, adding sleeves to the girls' dresses and letting out hems where she could. Jasper had brought home a worn oilcloth coat from a trader passing through, and she'd lined it with wool and mended the seams so it fit him proper. He wore it without saying much, but she noticed how he ran his hand over the collar now and then, like it reminded him of something that mattered. One morning, the sheriff rode out to the homestead, his horse sweating from the ride. Jasper went to meet him at the gate while Susanna stood just inside the doorway, the girls clinging to her skirts. Boone, the sheriff said, tipping his hat. Got a letter for you. Came through the post with your name on it. Didn't know where else to bring it. Jasper took the envelope and nodded. Appreciate it. The sheriff glanced toward the house, then back to Jasper. Some folks in town still don't know what to make of you two. Jasper folded the letter without opening it. I don't need them to. The sheriff gave a dry laugh. Didn't think you did. Ride safe. Once the man had gone, Jasper stood for a long while under the cottonwood near the barn, turning the envelope over in his hand. He didn't open it. Susanna stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter. Bad news, could be, he said. Came from Kansas. My mother's hand. She walked to the edge of the porch. You haven't spoken of her before. She's a hard woman, he said, eyes still on the paper. Last I saw her, she said I'd never make anything steady of myself. Might be she was right for a while. Susanna didn't press. She only said, you can read it when you're ready or not at all. That night after the girls were asleep, she found him in the barn loft, lantern lit beside him, the letter opened but unread in his lap. She wrote to tell me my father took sick, he said, voice low. Not asking me to come. Just said he wasn't likely to see another spring. Susanna sat beside him on the hay-strewn boards. Do you want to go? I thought I might, he said, until I sat up here and realized I didn't know what I'd say to him. She folded her hands in her lap. You don't owe him anything. No, Jasper said, but I thought maybe if I could show him I'd built something real, he'd understand I'm not the man he thought I was. She turned toward him, the lantern soft between them. You've built something more solid than most men ever do. You've given my daughters a steady hand, my home a second chance, and me a kind of quiet I never thought I'd earn. He looked down at the letter. That's the only truth I need then. In the morning, he burned the envelope in the stove, no ceremony to it. The snow deepened that week, enough that Susanna had to lift Olive onto Jasper's shoulders when they walked the ridge to check the trap lines. He carried her without complaint, her mittened hands clutching his ears like reins. Opal followed close behind, dragging her own little sled, determined not to be left behind. At the top of the ridge, the wind dropped and the world stretched white and still around them. Jasper crouched beside the trap, freeing a rabbit from the snare. Opal watched with quiet focus. You're not squeamish, he said. No, she answered. Mama says if we eat meat, we have to know where it comes from. He gave a nod. She's right. Later, as they sat beneath a windbreak of furs, Susanna passed around bread wrapped in cloth. The girls ate with red cheeks and shining eyes, their boots tucked under Jasper's coat to keep warm. "I never knew a woman who could make a winter day feel like something worth remembering," he said, watching her. She smiled, brushing hair from her face. "I never knew a man who could make my girls laugh in the snow." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I'd marry you today if a preacher could get here through this weather." She didn't pull away. "And I'd say yes today, even without a preacher." He leaned close, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then when the thaw comes, we'll make it official. But I'll live like your husband from now until then." She kissed him, slow and sure, with the hush of the trees around them and the snow falling silent as breath. Below the ridge, Dry Creek carried on unaware. But on that hill, a family was being made not by ceremony, but by choice. By daily labor and shared firelight, by small kindnesses and steady hands. By love that didn't ask permission. By late December, the snow lay thick enough to muffle every sound but the crack of frost splitting old wood and the rustle of animals bedding down for the night. Inside the Dearing house, the hearth burned steady, casting long gold across the floor where Olive and Opal sat stringing dried apple slices onto twine. Jasper hunched near the fire, sharpening the blade of a drawknife, while Susanna hemmed the sleeves of a shirt she was making him from salvaged flannel. The rhythm of life had softened. Not idle, never that, but slowed into something that held. They moved through their days like people who knew exactly where they belonged, even if they hadn't expected to find it. Jasper set aside the knife and leaned back against the hearth stones. "You ever think about what you'd have done if you hadn't come back here?" Susanna didn't look up from her stitching. "I used to imagine all kinds of places, towns where no one knew me, cities with paved streets and gas lamps, but they were just pictures in my head. I never saw myself in them. What changed?" She held up the sleeve, inspecting the seam. "I stopped needing to run from the truth." He nodded slowly. "I spent so many years moving that I forgot what it felt like to want to stay. Until I saw you walking up Main Street with those girls like you didn't owe anyone a blessed thing." "I didn't," she said softly, "and I still don't." Opal set down her string of apples and crawled into Jasper's lap, curling against his chest like she'd always belonged there. He wrapped his arms around her without a word. Olive climbed onto the couch beside her mother and promptly fell asleep, her head resting on Susanna's thigh. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, but inside the house, there was warmth enough to hold back the dark. That week, Jasper began digging post holes in the frozen earth behind the house, his breath steaming in the air as he worked through snow that came up to his knees. Susanna stood at the window, pressing her palm to the glass as she watched him, her expression unreadable. When he came in for supper, hands raw and blistered, she handed him a salve made from goose grease and pine resin. He sat on the stool by the stove while she smeared it gently onto his palms. He didn't flinch. "You building a corral?" she asked, voice low. He looked at her. "Something like it." She held his hand a moment longer. "You don't have to prove anything to me." "I'm not," he said. "I just want this place to be more than where we sleep. I want it to be ours." That night, after the girls were asleep, they sat on the edge of the bed in silence, her hand resting on his knee. The fire had burned low and the room was wrapped in shadow. "I've been thinking," he said. "About the spring." She turned toward him. "There's a man in Billings I used to know. He sells seed and livestock, helps folks get started with small holdings. I'd like to ride out and speak with him, see what we can manage." She nodded once. "If you think it'll help us stand on our own, do it." He studied her face. "You ever think you'd have a man under your roof again?" "Not one like you," she said. He reached for her hand. "I never thought I'd have a woman who trusted me to stay." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "Then we're both further along than we expected." They lay down in the dark, her head tucked beneath his chin, and sleep came easy. By February, the snow began to melt in slow rivers off the roof. The hens laid more regular now, and Jasper had finished the posts behind the barn, 24 of them, set straight as soldiers, ready for fencing. He'd already traded with the Simmonses for a pair of young milk goats, which he planned to collect come thaw. The girls had taken to following him around the yard, asking questions about seeds and soil. He answered everyone, patient as a tree. One morning, Susanna stepped out onto the porch with her shawl wrapped tight and found Jasper standing beside the hitch rail, holding something small and wrapped in burlap. "What's that?" He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a ring carved from wood plane, save for a band of inlaid brass polished smooth. "I made it from the old fence rail," he said. "The one that split in the storm, thought it was fitting." She stared at it a long moment. "You've got brass hands, Jasper Boone." He slipped it onto her finger. "Only because you gave them something worth holding." The wedding was held beneath the cottonwood behind the barn, with Reverend Ellison wrapped in a thick scarf and the girls clutching small bundles of dried flowers they'd gathered from beneath the thawing snow. The townsfolk came more than Susanna expected. Even Miss Thistle brought a tin of honey biscuits and nodded stiffly when Jasper thanked her. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," Susanna whispered as they stood hand in hand. "You earned it," Jasper said. "Every hour. Every scar." The vows were spoken with no flourish, no grand declarations, just the truth, plain and clean as snow melt. Afterward, they served stew from a great pot that had simmered all morning, and the girls danced in their stocking feet across the packed earth. Susanna watched them from the porch, her head resting against Jasper's shoulder. "You think this'll last?" she asked. He pressed a kiss to her hair. "It already has." Years passed and the land bloomed under their hands. The goats birthed twins that spring. A neighbor's old plow was traded for a team of mules. Rows of corn and beans rose from the soil, green and sure. The girls grew tall, strong from chores and soft from love, and called him Pa without hesitation. The house expanded one room, then another. Not grand, but solid. Built nail by nail, with laughter between the hammer swings, Jasper never left. He didn't need to. Susanna never ran. She didn't have to. And on cold nights, when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low, they lay side by side, hands entwined, hearts steady, the long ache of their pasts soothed into silence. Together, they had built a life strong enough to hold. And in it, they loved each other without fear, without question. Home was no longer a place she returned to. It was something they had made.